In the big story that's developed today, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has become the latest Western leader to advocate for India's inclusion as a permanent member to the United Nations Security Council. Now, this support follows similar endorsements from US President Joe Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron. India has long argued, of course, that it demands and deserves a permanent seat at the UNSC due to its growing geopolitical influence and contributions to global peacekeeping efforts. India last served as a non-permanent member from 2021 to 2022 and continues to advocate for reforms that reflect contemporary geopolitical realities. Now, currently, if you may know, the UNSC comprises of a two-tier system. It has 5 permanent members: Russia, the UK, China, France, and the United States, who of course have the veto power and are permanent members. And then, of course, they have 10 non-permanent members who are elected on a 2-year basis on rotation. These non-permanent members, of course, do not have veto powers, which is why there is an obvious power imbalance between the permanent 5 and the non-permanent 10. Now, even during the recent Quad Leaders Summit, which included leaders from the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, there was a strong emphasis on the necessity for comprehensive reforms within the United Nations, further highlighting the growing support for India's enhanced role in global governance. Before I move forward for a short discussion, let's listen in to those emphatic words of support coming in from the heads of state of both the United Kingdom and France.
If we want the system to deliver for the poorest and most vulnerable, then their voices must be heard. We need to make the system more representative and more responsive to those who need it most. So we will make the case, not just for fairer outcomes, but fairer representation in how we reach them. And this also applies to the Security Council. It has to change to become a more representative body, willing to act, not paralysed by politics. We want to see permanent African representation on the Council. Brazil, India, Japan and Germany as permanent members, and more seats for elected members as well.
Let's make the UN more efficient. Firstly, perhaps making them more representative. And that's why France, as I reiterate here, is in favour of the Security Council being expanded. Germany, Japan, India, Brazil should be permanent members, much like 2 countries that Africa will decide to represent them. These new elected members.
Let me go across to my guests joining me. We have Ray Locker, journalist and author, and also Patikrit Payne, geopolitical analyst. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us on the Global Mirror tonight. Ray, let's start with you. It's interesting and bizarre, isn't it, frankly speaking, that the United Nations Security Council, which is supposed to be the preeminent global body when it comes to dealing with global conflicts and crises, is still built on a global world order that was last seen in 1945. A lot of our viewers often don't realize that the logic behind having these specific 5 nations as the permanent members are because these were the nations that won the Second World War. So we're looking at a global order which is not even reflective of the Cold War that happened later. Forget 21st century realities. Clearly, Ray, the United Nations Security Council is long overdue when it comes to an overhaul and a revamp of existing geopolitical realities.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you won't get me to defend the current structure. As you mentioned, it's a legacy of the end of World War II, when India wasn't even an independent nation. It was a British colony. And at the time, and then for years, the China that was represented on the Security Council wasn't the People's Republic of China, but it was the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan. That finally changed in the early 1970s. So the UN definitely has not kept up with the pace of change in the world. As the world's most populous nation, India definitely should be a permanent member of the Security Council. And I think that the only reason it hasn't been is because of a reluctance to change the way things are set up, because there's some power that's accrued by having a permanent membership. And if you let other people in, you lose some of that power. And it seems like the Western nations, particularly the United States, UK, and France, have finally come around to realizing it's time to make a change.
But Ray, has the UNSC effectively, by its very constitution, bound itself in a self-defeating spiral? Because you mentioned the fact that the reason why there haven't been any attempts or serious attempts to try and reconstitute the UNSC is because of the very setup it is right now. India, for instance, can get all the unstinted support it needs from the United States, the UK, and France, and even from Russia, but it will never get that support from China as long as the other nations are supporting India. In fact, even Russia may turn out to be cagey if you have the other three Western countries supporting India. Similarly, a nation like Japan, for instance, will always be vetoed by China, if not by Russia. So, have we locked ourselves into a vicious cycle where the very nature and the constitution of the UNSC will prevent any attempts to try and improve it, try to reconstitute it, and try to rebalance the global structures?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the UN Constitution and Charter and how things are structured, but as long as China has an outstanding role in who gets to be a new member of the Security Council, that's going to be a problem. I mean, I don't have to explain to you the role that China plays against India. I mean, there's a long-standing rivalry there that's only gotten more pronounced as India has gained more authority and more power. So I don't know what it takes to make that change, but it's something that's long overdue. And it seems like the other countries, possibly not Russia, have recognized that it's time for India to have a permanent seat at the table.
Patrick, let me bring you in at this point. The debate for India deserving a permanent seat at the UNSC is something that has been going on for a while now. And frankly speaking, a lot of the Western powers, for all the criticism that one may level against them, they've never really expressed any strong opposition to India's stand. The problem comes from China, if not nations closer to China, for instance, Pakistan. How do we, even if possible, maneuver ourselves around this seemingly impossible paradox where we have to somehow get the world's warring nations, world's competing superpowers on the same table and allow a nation to be at the same table, a nation whose rise may hurt or even hinder and threaten some of their own interests?
Well, first and foremost, it's true that the Western countries have actually not opposed, but at the same time, they do realize, do know that if they want India to be part of it, that invariably that would require reform in the UNSC Charter, and I don't think that anyone has said that it's important to reform the Charter. Secondly, it is imperative for United Nations today to reform in order to remain relevant. That is something that both United Nations and all the P5 countries, especially the Western countries, also must realize. The reason is this, that when it comes to actually, having its say in the global order or global scheme of things, India has done things without being part of the UNSC P5. For example, when it comes to dealing with terrorism, or when it comes to dealing with, ensuring that conflicts do not go beyond the point, nobody looks up to UN, frankly, today. Even the UNSC P5 countries actually go their own way to actually trigger conflicts when United Nations don't agree to them. And then when it comes to pandemic, we haven't seen the kind of alacrity or initiative from the United Nations that is expected. So today, it is important for the P5 members, for United Nations to decide as to whether they want India to be part of it or not, because even if they don't, India will have its own way. And that's how BRICS have gone ahead. It's because there is a lot of reluctance on the part of the Western countries also, and not just China, to reform United Nations. They want the status quo to continue. The Western countries, with all due respect, know exactly that they can continue to say that we support India, knowing well that when it comes to a voting, there is a veto power of China which would not allow India to come in. At the same time, please understand, the West also must realize and acknowledge that including India would not mean, just because they're supporting, would not mean that India would be into their club tomorrow. So India has its own independent foreign policy and its own way of looking at things. You remember what Mr. Jaishankar said, that you created G7, you have made it exclusive, so we created an alternate BRICS forum. Also, there are a lot of things on which Prime Minister has spoken so far as UN is concerned. Number one, you have to have multilateral reforms, and secondly, unilateral sanctions. You tell me the Western countries go and impose these sanctions. They do not take any kind of permission from United Nations. So it is important for United Nations to reinvent itself to remain relevant. Whether India becomes part of the P5 or not, or UNSC's Permanent Council, Security Council or not, India would play its role. Today, you tell me, is anyone expecting United Nations to play a role to resolve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Nobody looks up to United Nations. They're asking for India. Whether India can do it or not, that's another issue. But how many countries today actually believe that let us go to United Nations? They are the best to solve the problems. So irrespective of what West wants, what China wants, it is important for UN to decide what actually they want, because otherwise they will continue to be where they are. It is an important forum, but they will continue to remain as irrelevant or more relevant in future than what it is today. Look at G20, BRICS, many other forums individually also. Countries look up to India to actually distribute vaccines to 100-odd countries, not the United Nations. Back to you.
All right, Trey, comment on that very important and strong point made by Pathikrit there. Is this much ado about nothing, given the fact that the United Nations, especially the Security Council, as we have discussed and you have agreed also, is inherently a very outdated framework and is now speeding towards irrelevance? Because we've seen in the last few years, both in the conflict in Ukraine and then the conflict which began last year at Gaza Strip, any important resolution that is brought in by the Western world is very frequently and almost invariably vetoed by either Russia or either China. And as a result, there is a sense of policy paralysis that always plagues the United Nations. So are we now looking at a stage where perhaps almost what happened a century ago is repeating here, and the United Nations is gradually, especially the Security Council, is gradually edging towards irrelevance and obsolescence, given what happened, say, with the League of Nations a century ago?
Well, I think, the last time the Security Council was really relevant was in 1950. And that was when the Soviet Union's ambassador didn't show up for a Security Council meeting, and the council voted to get involved in the Korean War on behalf of South Korea. I mean, since then, I'm no UN expert, but I can't think of any other time when it's really mattered in that way. The UN is a great debating forum. It's great to have the General Assembly and people from around the world go there and meet, and a lot of important things happen during the sessions and on the side of the sessions. I mean, some of these side conversations led to the U.S.-Iranian nuclear treaty during the Obama administration. That was very helpful. But not really when it comes to real substantive stuff. Somebody has a veto, somebody's interests are not going to be served by Security Council decisions, so they veto it. So Pathikrit's right. In a lot of cases, it just doesn't matter. But it's important, and it should matter more. And it won't matter more unless it gets India on there, because it's the most populous nation in the world. It has tremendous economic clout. And its interests are aligned more with the United States than most people in the United States certainly realize. So it's in our interest to have India as a full-time participant.
Does some of that blame also lie with the liberal international order or the West as we look at it? Because as Pathikrit has been pointing out, while they have been making the right noises when it comes to the inclusion of India and other global South nations here, there hasn't been any meaningful process or meaningful dialogue being initiated to try and reform the UN Charter itself, which essentially results in this being a fallacy.
Well, I could speak about the U.S. Constitution whenever people talk about a new constitutional convention to tweak some of the problems with our current Constitution. Yeah. There's a great fear about what could happen once you open that thing up. And I think some of those fears are legitimate. And maybe those fears exist about reopening the UN Charter. But clearly, there are issues that need to be addressed. I don't know how it happens because, as I said, I'm not an expert in that. But, if you're really serious about having India have a permanent seat on the Security Council and reforming the Charter is the way to make that happen, then you need to do it. You need to make a move to make that happen, because anything else is just meaningless. You're just, oh, yeah, that'd be great. But so what? Talk is cheap, right? And so unless you're willing to take the steps to do something concrete, then it's just talk.
Fair enough. Patrick, I'll come to you for the last word. How does India navigate this forward? Because as you pointed out, India has, and to its credit, has been taking a lot of steps to build forward a consensus amongst global south, especially when it comes to countries from Africa, and try and increase the representation of the global south in general, which is why we have seen, as you pointed out, the success of summits like the BRICS or the G20. But at the same time, there's still a legacy associated with the UNSC, and being a part of the UNSC permanent nations, as obsolete or as outdated it might be, is a matter of Western validation, is a matter of prestige. So how do we navigate these two priorities?
Well, look at this. In the last few years, especially in the last 2-3 years, Prime Minister of India has stopped going to the UNGA and addressing the assembly there. Before that, for several years, Prime Minister Modi kept on saying that UN must define what terrorism is, and that UN must go for multilateral institutions reform. They have turned a blind, they actually become deaf to those advices. So what has happened? India has started the Voice of Global South Forum. There are 123 countries which attend. They look up to India. In G20, India took the pioneering step of including African Union. India does not have a panacea or a golden stick that it can, or magic wand that it can solve all the problems, but it is far more proactive and pragmatic in terms of looking forward to the issues that smaller and vulnerable countries face. For example, when you have unilateral sanctions imposed on a country like Russia or in Iran or many others, for whatever reason, it has a tremendous impact on the supply chain of critical commodities. I have never come across UN saying that it impacts smaller countries more than anyone else, and therefore we should rethink about it, because smaller countries like Sri Lanka became bankrupt primarily because of these unilateral sanctions that had this tremendous impact. India has been a lone voice that you need to do something about it. Or when you talk about institutional reforms in organizations like World Bank, when Sri Lanka was in a deep financial crisis, I don't remember any major financial institution coming forward to help Sri Lanka. India went ahead with $4 billion of all kinds of support, even when it was itself recovering and battling the post-pandemic economic crisis. So I think it is about the intent. If you say that UN has reduced itself only to a prestige forum, absolutely fine. They will continue to exist, as I said. Nobody is saying that UN should be shut down. But for all practical purposes, people and major countries, smaller countries have stopped looking up to UN. Do we go to UN to solve the Indo-Pak issue or Indo-China issue? No. We know that we have to do it on our own. That is where, as I say, if UN has to remain relevant, then it has to reform. Or it can just remain as a ceremonial body as it has been for the last several decades.
So the overwhelming sentiment coming out from this discussion at this point is that perhaps the UNSC needs India as a permanent member a lot more than India needs the permanent membership of the UNSC, especially for the legitimacy of the world's largest and most premier international body. Thanks a lot, Ray and Patrikrit, for joining us with this very short and insightful discussion on the global mirror. Patrikrit mentioned Sri Lanka. That is an island nation going through a lot of crisis, but it now has a new leader as well.